welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem with you from New York. This week, where the UN General Assembly session is in full swing, just a little while ago, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, started addressing the General Assembly. He will be followed closely by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Joining us in Washington studios is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who's the Vice President for Research at the Foundation of Defense for Democracies. He's also author of several books on Middle East. Joining us again from Washington, D.C.'s Woodrow Wilson Studios is Aaron David Miller, who's a fellow there. He's also an author of several books on Middle East, and he's a former advisor to no less than 6 secretaries of state. And joining us on phone from South Carolina is Dr. Josef Olmert. He's a top Middle East scholar, former peace negotiator, published author, advisor to one Israeli prime minister, and brother of another Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. And starting with you, Dr. Schanzer, is the Middle East peace process dead, or is it on life support?
It is probably somewhere in between. I'm not quite ready to call it dead yet, but it has been in a coma for quite some time. The bottom line is that you have an Israeli government that isn't particularly interested in negotiating with this government. And this government, meaning that of Mahmoud Abbas, he is a prime minister who is gone 3 years past the end of his term. He is actually not the elected representative of the Palestinians. It was Hamas. I can hear you.
Okay. So, Dr. Schanzer, you mentioned that the Israelis don't want to talk to this particular president. We'll come back to why that is. But I want to come to you, Dr. Olmert. Mahmoud Abbas started his by focusing on the settlements. He is saying that this is a way that Israel's trying to de facto annex the land and make it part of Israel. Why would Israel not stop the settlement activity?
Well, that's a great question, and I would argue to you that this current juncture, if I was in a position to advise the Prime Minister, and I'm not, I would advise him, to slow down this settlement activity very significantly, if not even to suspend it. If not for other reason, and it sounds cynical to you, if not for other reasons, for the fact that even if you do suspend it completely, I don't believe that that in itself would reignite the peace process, which is more or less moribund, at least at this stage. So the point really is that we may have to look for other reasons why the peace process is moribund, other than the question of the settlements. But as I said to you in direct answer to your question, if it was up to me, I would have suspended all settlement activity at this particular juncture, and yet I would have argued to you it's not going to reignite the peace process, or at least not necessarily.
Okay, then let me ask Mr. Miller, what is going to reignite the peace process then?
I mean, you have 3 missing ingredients. You put them all back in place, and I'll give you not only a process, but maybe an agreement. Number one, you have insufficient leadership on both sides. You have men who are essentially prisoners of their political constituencies, not masters of them. Number two, you have insufficient urgency. The fact is, as bad as the situation is, there's insufficient pain and insufficient prospects of gain to motivate either Abbas or Netanyahu to make the kinds of decisions necessary. 3, you have enormous gaps between the issues, between the parties on the core issues. I was one of the 12 Americans at Camp David, and if I hear one more time that the Israelis and Palestinians were this close to an agreement, I think I'm going to, well, I'm not sure what I would do.
You read that you will toss your lunch out, or so I read.
Yeah, but that's an accurate description, because the fact is we're not this close to an agreement. We're this close to an agreement. I'm probably not on camera anymore, actually. And finally, we do not have an American administration that is either right now willing, able, or frankly, willful and skillful enough, assuming the other 3 conditions were in place, to do what is required. So, I mean, whether it's in a coma, on life support, dead, and in Israeli politics, a very wise Israeli once said to me, you can be dead or you can be dead and buried. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that the peace process is just dead.
Okay, so Dr. Schanzer, you heard what Mr. Miller just said. The peace process is dead, not buried yet. You mentioned something. You said Mr. Abbas is not the true representative of his people right now. The Palestinian Authority seems to be in disarray. It doesn't get along with Hamas despite the efforts of regional powers. So the question is, who do the Israelis talk to at this point, even if all the ingredients that Mr. Miller mentioned were in place?
Well, that's exactly the point that I've been making for about the last 5 years, and that is that there is no credible interlocutor on the Palestinian side. On the one hand, you have Hamas, which was elected in 2006, but they, of course, don't recognize the state of Israel. They have a record of suicide bombings and firing rockets into Israel, and no Western country wishes to engage with them, or no Western country in their right mind, at any rate. And then, on the other hand, you've got Mahmoud Abbas, who is 3 years past the end of his term. He is the unelected representative of the Palestinians, yet somehow he's invited to the UN to talk today about Palestinian statehood, which raises actually a whole other question. If and when this state is declared, whether it's an unofficial state, an observer state, or whether it's fully accredited by the UN Security Council, you are looking at an entity that is probably in violation of the Oslo Accords, because those agreements were designed to iron out all of the issues between the Palestinians and Israelis. And then you also have to wonder whether it includes the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or only the West Bank. There are so many unanswered questions at this point with this Palestinian government. The Palestinian political landscape is so fractured that it makes it almost impossible to even think about getting back to the table.
Well, Mr. Miller, what I want to ask you is that we talked about U.S. You said the government right now is not skillful enough, but even if it was, is U.S. considered a neutral negotiator? A lot of the Arab world looks at U.S. and says they don't put pressure on Israel when needs to be put pressure on Israel. How is U.S. looked upon, and what is U.S.'s role in this process?
Well, look, I think you have to differentiate between times when America has in fact succeeded in its diplomacy and at times when it's failed. We've had several successes. Under Kissinger during the 70s, we negotiated 3 disengagement agreements. Under Carter during the late 70s, we helped broker an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and under George Bush 41 and Jim Baker, between 1989 and 1991, we put together a fairly credible process which led to a historic peace conference at Madrid. So the reality is the United States has in fact played the role of an effective and credible broker. But let me make one point. There is a concept in negotiations called the paradox of the partial mediator. Let's be clear. The United States is not an honest broker. We have a very special relationship with the State of Israel, and I would argue to you that it is in fact that intimacy that gives us the unique advantage that we do have. We have the capacity, if applied correctly, with wisdom, with fairness, and with reassurance, to actually help the Israelis make the kinds of decisions possible. But let's be clear, we are not, by any stretch of the imagination, an honest broker. But we can be and Sadat understood this, Hussein understood it. We can, in fact, be an effective broker, and that is something we have not been, frankly, since Bush 41 and his eminently talented Secretary of State, James Baker.
James Baker, thank you. Mr. Olmert, Dr. Olmert, what I want to say is if U.S. is not an honest broker, as Mr. Miller said, although he suggested it can be an effective broker, why should the Palestinians trust it?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that when I listened to Aaron David, my old friend, I remember the days of Madrid. And obviously it was, a momentous time and 8 days and all that. And we were sitting together in the waiting room when Baker and Shamir, the late Shamir, met personally 8 times, eye to eye and all that, and then Madrid. But the fact of the matter is that even Madrid, in the end of the day, it wasn't Madrid that led to the Oslo Accord. You might argue that it started the process that somehow went astray, and still it led to Oslo. But Oslo was not the immediate direct result of Madrid. So even that, I would question the validity of the process there. But I would completely agree with Aaron David about the fact that the U.S. is an effective broker once they apply their brokerage in an effective way. And I'll come back to your question about the Palestinians in a minute, but let me just say, look, one of the problems of all this situation is that whenever there is a new American administration, they try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So if you look back at the history of American administrations, whenever they come to power, they have an immediate this or that doctrine about the Middle East, and this and that peace plan, and they tend to forget that something was already done before, and maybe you should follow on the footsteps of what was achieved. I don't want to brag about the achievements of former Prime Minister of Israel, who I happen to know very well, he's my brother, but he met Abbas 11 times eye-to-eye personally. in Jerusalem 11 times, we came to an understanding that might or not have led to a final agreement. I'm not sure about it. However, during all this time, when they negotiated, there was no question about the settlements. Abbas continued the negotiations even though there was some settlement activity. Here comes the new American administration, the Obama administration, and all of a sudden they bring it back to the point of settlements, create an artificial crisis with the Israelis, and nothing comes out of it. Look, the Palestinians know that every possible avenue that they can use with the U.S. would be much more beneficial to them than, say, working with any other power, whom they can work with. The Chinese, the Russians, they can work only with the Americans. And in many respects, they have achieved great deals for working with the Americans. I don't think that the problem for the Palestinians right now is... Let me just
Dr. Olmert. Dr. Olmert, let me bring Dr. Schanzer in this debate. Dr. Schanzer, first of all, do you agree about U.S.'s role, and also what Mr. Miller said? I think that there's not enough pain on both sides to move forward when we hear in the news every day about the pain on both sides. So why is there not that drive to do something?
Well, I think there is a sense of urgency. I think the Palestinians and Israelis both wish that they could get things back on track, but I do think that we have seen a lot of missteps on the part of this administration. I mean, I think that Mr. Olmert is right to talk about the fact that it was the U.S. that brought up the issue of settlements, made it a sticking point early on in the Obama administration, and after some time, I think the president here realized that it was not something that he'd be able to pursue. It was not a smart course of action, and so he stepped down from it. And the response from Mahmoud Abbas, from the president of the Palestinians, was that he went up in the tree with President Obama, but Obama came down and took away the ladder. And so that's why you hear President Mahmoud Abbas in front of the UN today talking about settlements, making it a big issue, when in fact it wasn't a big issue during the Olmert administration. So what's happened here is that you've seen the president of the United States anger both the Israelis over the fact that he was able to make the settlements a crucial issue in this conflict, and then the Palestinians who are upset with him because he backed away from this issue that he helped raise. And so he's lost the faith of both sides, and I think that is really the reason why you have, as Aaron mentioned, neither side wanting to come back to the table, because the United States has lost a lot of credibility as the broker of this peace process.
Could there be an alternative broker? Could European Union pick up, or UN pick up, or somebody else?
In my opinion, no. I think that certainly not the UN. We've seen way too many anti-Israel proclamations come out of the UN. It is rigged basically in favor of the Palestinians, and the Israelis barely get a word in edgewise, and they're very sensitive about this. Most of the Israelis that I talk to have very little faith in the UN at this time. The EU is perhaps a little bit more credible, but again, doesn't have the same kind of special relationship with the Israelis. You have to remember, the Israelis are keenly aware of their security problems. They are isolated in a region that is very unfriendly to them, and they rely heavily on the United States for military aid and assistance. They want to make sure that the United States has their back, and that's why what you see right now, these tensions between Israel and the United States, has really had a very detrimental effect on the U.S.-Israel relationship and on the ability to move forward with this peace process.
On the peace process. So, Mr. Miller, the question then is, what Dr. Schanzer just said, there are too many anti-Israeli proclamations that have come out of the UN. Somebody on the Palestinian side might argue, but there are too many pro-Israeli movements in the U.S. and too many anti-Palestinian proclamations coming out of U.S. So why should the Palestinian side trust the U.S.?
Well, right now, I suspect there is no reason to. But again, the reality is, if in fact you have conditions that would allow a credible and serious negotiation to begin, the United States does, at least on paper, have the capacity to work with both sides, particularly the Israelis, assuming there was a foundation on which to build a negotiation. And that I think the Americans can still deliver. You just don't have, however, and Yossi Olmert's point is a critical one. What you do not have among the Israelis and the Palestinians is the ownership that is required to begin a serious process. If you look at the American role, what you find is very intriguing. It is only at the end, once there has been traction, once there's been some understanding between Arabs and Israelis. It was true of Sadat when Dayan showed up here in November of '77 October, actually, to brief the State Department on Begin's secret contacts with Sadat. It was true of the clandestine negotiations between Israel and Jordan, and as Yossi correctly referred to, it was not Madrid that produced Oslo. It was the secret understandings in 92 and 93. So the U.S. has an important role to play. It cannot impose, it cannot deliver Israel, but that sense of ownership, which is vitally important, just doesn't exist. Larry Summers, a very smart man, former president of Harvard, Secretary of the Treasury, once said something profoundly important. He said, in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And the reason you don't wash a rental car is because you care only about what you own. And Israelis and Palestinians need to have that sense of ownership. And right now, sadly, tragically, they don't.
Okay, so my understanding is what you're saying is that U.S.'s role becomes important once Israelis and Palestinians are moving on something, and then U.S. steps in and helps them kind of bridge the final few paces. Is that what happened at Camp David with President Jimmy Carter, Dr. Olmert? And is that another way? What Jimmy Carter did is for 13 days, he just shut them down in a room and said, nobody's coming out till we have an agreement.
No,
do you think that's...
with all due respect to Jimmy Carter, his role in that was very significant, and no one should take it away from him, even though some Israelis, me included, would be very angry with what he has done later on and what he said about Israel. But look, it was Moshe Dayan who went to Morocco to meet Hassan Touami, the Egyptian envoy of Sadat. It was Menachem Begin who was sent him there because he got aware that somehow the Egyptians were interested. It was Sadat who came to Jerusalem and broke the walls of suspicion and fear on the part of the Israelis. Everybody was saying at that time, and what would happen if the Syrians came and all that? But they did not come, and others did not come, and Sadat came and got rewarded for that. And of course, the American involvement came exactly at the stage as Aaron David described it, at the time when you needed to have American pressure to finalize something that already was on foot. And the point really is, when we come to today, let's talk very, very briefly about the two elephants in the room that we don't mention or hardly mention. One of them is called the Arab Spring and its implications. The other one, of course, is the Iranian situation. If you are an Israeli prime minister now, you have to be very, 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 very careful not to get into any process with the Palestinians that at this particular stage would result with what you consider as major concessions at a time when there is so much instability around Israel because of the implications of the so-called Arab Spring or Arab Awakening on the one hand, and of course the question of Iran is unresolved. So let's put it into the equation and understand that you don't work in a limbo here. It's not a vacuum in which you deal only with one issue, and once it doesn't, you deal with others. You deal with all those issues simultaneously, and you come up with your decisions and solutions on the basis of the accumulating experience of all those issues at this particular moment.
Okay, and you have led us to the next point, which I was going to make, which is the Iranian nuclear program, which we are hearing will be the focal point of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's UN address, which should be about to start in half an hour and an hour. Dr. Schanzer, what impact does the Iranian situation have on the Middle East peace process? Is it going to totally take attention away from it?
Absolutely, it has, and I think it has been a frustrating point for the Palestinians. In other words, every time they begin to protest what's going on in the territories, every time they begin to raise a new initiative with the Israelis or with the international community, it seems that the Iranian nuclear program trumps them. In fact, everything that we've seen in the Arab Spring has done the same. But actually, I would take issue with one thing that Mr. Olmert said, and that is that this would, at least in my opinion, would represent probably a very interesting time for the Palestinians and Israelis to engage quietly. In other words, not to do so publicly, because that is exactly when all the crazies come out.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that, sure.
Yeah, it's a good time to begin to engage and to do so quietly, so that they can have at least a basis of understanding for whenever, hopefully, this Iranian nuclear program is settled. But the bottom line is as long as this sword of Damocles is hanging over the Israelis' heads, they are not going to want to stick their necks out. That is absolutely the case. They won't be able to commit to anything. And so this is why I think the Prime Minister of Israel has rightly asserted that this is really the only issue that he can really tackle right now before moving on to other issues.
Mr. Miller, although all of you have explained that settlement is not what stops the two sides from talking, but since it became a big issue in Mr. Abbas's speech, and he also talked about some other human rights issues, some people have argued that the human rights issues in the Palestinian territories are actually hardening the hearts and minds rather than softening them, and it's making it more difficult for the Palestinians to sit down with Israel and talk about anything.
Well, it's true, and I think it's true, but it doesn't change the reality that the Israeli occupation and the anomalies and contradictions that continue this perverse dance between the occupier and the occupied will only be resolved when, in fact, you have a deal through negotiations. So the issue, settlements, human rights abuses, is to try to find the best focus. And there's going to be tensions with Israel, and there's going to be tensions with the Palestinians. But it's important that these tensions, these fights, become productive. And I agree 100% with what Jonathan has said and what Yossi has essentially implied, that the fight between Obama and Netanyahu over settlement activity was one of the most unproductive fights. If you're going to fight with an Israeli prime minister who has a lot of credibility in the pro-Israeli community here, you want to find an issue that in the end is worth the fight, that makes you, the president, look good, makes the Israeli prime minister look good, and makes the Palestinians look good too. Settlements was the absolute wrong issue, because in the end, we went up the ladder, we went down. Obama's credibility was undermined not just with Netanyahu, but with the Palestinians and the Arabs as well. And it's left the administration with absolutely no successes. I have never, by the way, in watching this relationship, I don't know whether my colleagues would agree, seen a more dysfunctional pair between
Aaron, Shamir and Bush 41.
Well,
remember?
but even Yossi says Shamir and Bush 41, but even Shamir and Bush 41 managed to cooperate not only on Iraq but on Madrid. 4 years in, you have no trust between these two guys. You have no sense of understanding, and you have no joint enterprise in which they're both invested. And I think that makes this really one of the saddest and sorriest episodes in the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
So, Dr. Olmert, the question then is, post-election, because the elections bring internal politics to the forefront and a lot of important issues go to the back burner, post-election, do you think it'll be different between President Obama and the Israeli administration?
Well, you already elected President Obama. I'm not sure about that, although it seems like a very strong
yes, you're right. I apologize. Whichever the U.S. administration
there's no need to apologize. It looks like the polls show it in this direction. But look, here is a problem, by the way, for Mr. Netanyahu, because I would argue, and maybe what I'm going to say now would surprise both Jonathan and Aaron David, if I was Netanyahu, I would have not raised the bells of war with Iran, particularly in the 2 months ahead of the American presidential elections, particularly that according to Netanyahu and his people themselves, the point of no return may be only in the spring of 2013. So in that case, why would you do anything or say anything that might even remotely be construed as an intervention in American politics? And I think that this is a point that would be held against him if indeed this administration will be in power. I don't think it would lead to any cataclysmic or apocalyptic results, because the American system is such that the support for Israel is ingrained in the system, and there is Congress and so on and so forth. But the point here is that in the question of Iran and in the question of implications of the crisis in Syria and the relationship with Egypt and Gaza and, of course, Iran, you see at least 5 questions on top of the one with which we started, Netanyahu-Abbas, about 6 questions. Each one of them has the potential of creating God knows what havoc in the Middle East, and therefore they will have to work together, and somebody will have to do the extra mile. And I suspect that as the junior partner of the alliance, it will be Netanyahu.
Okay, thank you very much. And since you so kindly pointed out, I have to say that we're a non-political, unbiased show, and we don't mind whichever president wins the election. But moving forward, Mr. Miller, you and both Dr. Schanzer, Iran, since President Obama said in his address that there's still time and space to solve the Iranian issue, although he said it's not unlimited, we expect Prime Minister Netanyahu to draw red lines. So are we seeing more of a head-on collision between the two allies on Iran than previously, starting with you, Mr. Miller?
I mean, I would think that this is one of those situations where any rational person wouldn't want to throw good money after bad and go down the same path and challenge the United States, Secretary of State, the President on red lines. And Yossi's absolutely right. The clock here is not before the elections. It's not even the end of the year. It's probably the spring of 2013. And why? The only thing that is worse for Netanyahu, in my view, than a re-elected Barack Obama is an angry re-elected Barack Obama. And that's essentially what he is helping to produce, which to me makes absolutely no sense given the importance of the U.S.-Israeli relationship and the fact that it's simply too big to fail. So I hope, although I've lost a lot of money before in making these bets, I hope that the speech today talks about the urgency and the imperative of the Iranian issue, because it is urgent, it is imperative, particularly for a small power living in a dangerous neighborhood with a dark past, but that there is no discussion of the issue of the critical importance of drawing red lines, let alone any detailed public discussion on this matter. I think it's premature and unwise. And I think it'll only redound to Mr. Netanyahu's, it won't redound to his credit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schanzer. In the last 30 seconds of the show, I'll let you wrap up and comment on this.
Sure. Well, I would just say this, that I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is probably standing down. Yes?
Go ahead, please, Mr. Schanzer. I'm told you have more time. I was misinformed, but that's okay.
Okay, very good to know. My point simply is that I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has largely stood down. I think he realized that his attempt to play chicken with the President of the United States was ill-advised, and I think we have seen already a more conciliatory Prime Minister, and we've seen actually a reach out on the part of Rahm Emanuel, former close confidant of the President, talking to the Defense Minister of Israel. You get the sense that things are being quietly worked out behind the scenes. But that's not to say that the Israelis are going to be any more calm or less agitated over the specter of a nuclear Iran. I think you're going to see continued nerves frayed. You're going to see the Israelis at their wits' end. And that actually gets to the point of I think, what the president needs to do. I can understand that he's got some concerns leading up to an election, but having an election should not preclude him from getting out and actually just asserting some leadership. What we need is a president who can begin to talk down our allies in Israel. And for that matter, talk down our allies in the rest of the Middle East. You've got Saudi Arabia nervous about this. A lot of the other countries in the Gulf are nervous about a nuclear Iran. The last thing we want to do is to put that entire region on tilt, and that's largely what's happened because the president has not come out and said, okay, forget about red lines. Let me just tell you what my plan is. We have not seen a real presidential address on his plan to address the Iranian nuclear program for many, many months. This is what I think is missing, and that's what I think would largely smooth over a lot of what's been happening between the Israelis and the United States in recent months.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very interesting and insightful talk. Unfortunately, we can't solve the problem in half an hour, what the world hasn't been able to solve for over half a century. So that's all the time we have for today. We will continue talking about this issue in the future. I must thank our guest, Jonathan Schanzer of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Aaron David Miller of Woodrow Wilson, Dr. Josef Olmert, the Middle East scholar. Thank you very much for watching. And those of you at home, please send us your comments on Facebook. Also check out our website, urduvoa.com, for latest stories, features, sports, and more. Here at Access Point, thank you very much. On behalf of my team, goodbye and good night. Welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem with you from New York this week, where the UN General Assembly session is in full swing. Just a little while ago, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, started addressing the General Assembly. He will be followed closely by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Joining us in Washington studios is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who's the Vice President for Research at the Foundation of Defense for Democracies. He's also author of several books on Middle East. Joining us again from Washington, D.C.'s Woodrow Wilson Studios is Erin David Miller, who's a fellow there. He's also an author of several books on Middle East, and he's a former advisor to no less than 6 secretaries of state. And joining us on phone from South Carolina is Dr. Josef Olmert. He's at
this particular juncture, and yet I would have argued to you it's not going to reignite the peace process, or at least not necessarily.
Okay, then let me ask Mr. Miller, what is going to reignite the peace process then?
I mean, you have 3 missing ingredients. You put them all back in place, and I'll give you not only a process, but maybe an agreement. Number one, you have insufficient leadership on both sides. You have men who are essentially prisoners of their political constituencies, not masters of them. Number two, you have insufficient urgency. The fact is, as bad as the situation is, there's insufficient pain and insufficient prospects of gain to motivate either Abbas or Netanyahu to make the kinds of decisions necessary. 3, you have enormous gaps between the issues, between the parties on the core issues. I was one of the 12 Americans at Camp David, and if I hear one more time that the Israelis and Palestinians were this close to an agreement, I think I'm going to, I'm not sure what I would
think
do.
you read that you will toss your lunch out, or so I read.
Yeah,
but
that's an accurate description, because the fact is we're not this close to an agreement. We're this close to an agreement. I'm probably not on camera anymore, actually. And finally, we do not have an American administration that is either right now willing, able, or frankly, willful and skillful enough, assuming the other 3 conditions were in place, to do what is required. So, I mean, whether it's in a coma, on life support, dead, and in Israeli politics, a very wise Israeli once said to me, you can be dead or you can be dead and buried. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the peace process is just dead.
Okay, so Dr. Schanzer, you heard what Mr. Miller just said. The peace process is dead, not buried yet. You mentioned something. You said Mr. Abbas is not the true representative of his people right now. The Palestinian Authority seems to be in disarray. It doesn't get along with Hamas, despite the top Middle East scholar, former peace negotiator, published author, advisor to one Israeli prime minister, and brother of another Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. And starting with you, Dr. Schanzer, is the Middle East peace process dead, or is it on life support?
It is probably somewhere in between. I'm not quite ready to call it dead yet, but it has been in a coma for quite some time. The bottom line is that you have an Israeli government that isn't particularly interested in negotiating with this government. And this government, meaning that of Mahmoud Abbas, he is a prime minister who is gone 3 years past the end of his term. He is actually not the elected representative of the Palestinians. It was Hamas. I can hear you.
Okay. So, Dr. Schanzer, you mentioned that the Israelis don't want to talk to this particular president. We'll come back to why that is. But I want to come to you, Dr. Olmert. Mahmoud Abbas started his by focusing on the settlements. He is saying that this is a way that Israel's trying to de facto annex the land and make it part of Israel. Why would Israel not stop the settlement activity?
Well, that's a great question, and I would argue to you that this current juncture, if I was in a position to advise the Prime Minister, and I'm not, I would advise him, to slow down this settlement activity very significantly, if not even to suspend it. If not for other reason, and it sounds cynical to you, if not for other reasons, for the fact that even if you do suspend it completely, I don't believe that that in itself would reignite the peace process, which is more or less moribund, at least at this stage. So the point really is that we may have to look for other reasons why the peace process is moribund, other than the question of the settlements. But as I said to you in direct answer to your question, if it was up to me, I would have suspended all settlement activity